Gentile, one in Messiah, one in Yeshua, one in the olive tree. Jew and Gentile, one in Messiah, one in Yeshua.
Alrighty, we are back. All prophecy fulfilled. We are on lesson number 2 of the Gentiles, Christianity's best kept secret, and what your pastor never, ever told you. Okay, look, I've got a boatload of information here, so let me just jump right into it. Quick review, 30-second review. What did we learn last lesson? Well, basically, we covered 3 things. Number 1, the actual word goy, goyim, ethnos, that is translated as Gentile. That is simply a multitude of individuals from the same category, from the same group. It's a collective term. So contrary to the very popular and assumptive notion that the Bible identifies people as an individual Gentile. Well, no, not really. Actually, the Bible identifies a collective group of individuals that comprise the whole, or the nation, or the nations collectively. So goy, goyim, ethnos, it really just means a people group. It means a tribe or tribes. It means a nation or nations. That's what it means. Number 2, we looked at the promise to Abraham and the promises to his seed and to all the nations that would be blessed. And I basically said one of 2 things. I said, number 1, the seed of Abraham. In the Old Testament, right off the bat, it is always and it is only Israel. Israel was Abraham's seed. Time and time again, we see that. And I know what you think the seed is in the New Testament, but hold off on that because we're going to get to that. But the point is, throughout the Old Testament, the prophets refer to Israel, Abraham's descendants, as his seed. That's it. But number 2, I said, look, as far as the nations, the goyim that would be blessed, let's reserve judgment on that until we get more information from the story, because I know what you think the nations are when we get to the New Testament. And I'm saying hold off on that. Let's let the story develop. Number 3, and I think probably the most important thing I wanted you to see was Ephraim. Genesis 48. Remember Ephraim, the house of Israel. They were prophesied. They were promised to become a multitude of Gentiles. Well, nations. But yes, Gentiles, goyim, Ephraim. And that is so important. I said, you know what? You need to table that. Put that right here because we're going to be coming back to that. So keep in mind, everything we do early in these lessons, it's going to come full circle. So let's start from the beginning of Israel's story at Sinai. Now look, I could start with Sinai, I could start with Abraham, I could start with Adam. But for our purposes in this lessons, we're going to begin Israel's covenant at Sinai, when they entered into covenant. Remember that? They were offered the covenant and they said, all these things we will do. It was like a collective coming into covenant. And that's where their covenant creation really began right there. We're going to start right there. So here's a 30,000 foot overview of the biblical story, and I'm going to build a proper contextual foundation or a background or a perspective when it comes to the goyim, when it comes to the Gentiles. Okay, so from Israel's beginnings at Sinai, listen to this. Their end as a people under that first covenant and under that law of Moses was in view. Did you get that? From their very beginning, from their first days, their last days were all but certain. They were already determined. According to the story, Yahweh through Moses actually told them up front the bad news, if you will. After farting around for like 40 years, and they were about to enter the promised land, speaking to Israel, what did Yahweh say? Well, here's some clips, if you will, from Deuteronomy 32. I'm just going to give them to you rapid fire. Deuteronomy 32. I will hide my face from them. speaking of Israel, speaking of his people, I will see what their end will be. For they are a perverse generation, children in whom is no faith. I will heap disasters on them. For they are a nation, goy, there's your nation, void of counsel. Nor is there any understanding to them. Oh, that they were wise, that they understood this, that they would consider their latter end. There's their end right there. Way in the beginning, hey, there's your end, Israel, right there. I could go on and on. So Deuteronomy 32, 28 through 32 really, is all about Israel's end. And he's laying it down like only 40 years really after becoming the people of God. That's interesting. And you know what? It's astonishing, really, if you think about it. We don't teach this stuff in Sunday school, do we? And we don't really cover it like in our church groups, do we? No. Why? Well, because it's not all, puppies and rainbows. It's not all good news about us. And we don't know really what the heck it means, and why it's important. And yet, this right here, Deuteronomy, this is the foundation to the rest of the story. Everything that goes after it or beyond it is set up right here. And this right here, Deuteronomy 32, is actually setting up exactly who, or I think more precisely, exactly which Gentiles later on are going to be in focus in the story. From the beginning, Israel had a predetermined end, and the ending wasn't pretty. It was going to end in judgment. Moses basically laid out Israel's history. Okay, so here's the predicted trajectory, as I like to call it, of Israel's story. You have a covenant creation at Sinai. God's people Israel. You have the giving of the law into the promised land under the blessings and or the curses of the law. And then you have nothing but trouble. That's a capital T that rhymes with P, and that stands for not pool. I don't know. Promised land? Couldn't think of it. Okay, nothing but trouble. You have warfare, you have disobedience, right? In fact, Israel's kingdom would be split in two. And this is exactly what I think I think most Christians actually are aware of this, but they just don't seem to get the significance of it in regard to the whole story, the splitting of the kingdom. But that's really the major part of the story. The kingdom was split. You got the northern tribes, you got the 10 northern tribes, you got the southern kingdom, Benjamin and Judah. You got, they were also called, they were basically called Judah, or the house of Judah. And the northern kingdom was called the house of Israel. Okay? And sometimes they were referred to as what? Ephraim. Yes, Ephraim. Remember last lesson, Ephraim. Genesis 48. And Ephraim was prophesied to become what? The nations, the goyim. They were going to become, Gentile. Oh man, that just sounds so weird, doesn't it? So back to the 30,000-foot view. You have a lot of turmoil. You have wars within. You have wars without. Disobedience, experiencing the curses of the covenant. But what would be the result of that? What would happen to Israel? Well, as promised, they would be continually scattered. They would be scattered throughout and among the nations, the goyim, the Gentiles. And there's just a boatload of verses that talk about Israel scattered. I did in my Last Days Biblically Defined series, I did like 3 or 4 lessons on Israel scattering and gathering. This ain't nothing new. So if you want a little more in-depth discussion on that, go look at those. But here's an example. Deuteronomy 28, 64 through 65. You, talking to Israel here, God's covenant people, Deuteronomy 28, you shall be plucked from off the land which you go to possess. Then the Lord will scatter you among all the peoples from one end of the land to the other. And there you shall serve other gods. which neither you nor your fathers have known, wood and stone. And among those nations you shall find no rest, Israel. Deuteronomy 4:23 and following. Take heed to yourselves, lest you forget the covenant of your Lord your God, which he made with you, and make for yourselves a carved image. And the Lord will scatter you among the peoples, and you will be left few in number among the nations, where the Lord will drive you. And there you will serve gods, the work of men's hands, wood and stone, which neither see nor hear, nor eat, nor smell. Now, did you notice the references to idolatry, right? Serving other gods. Prophet after prophet after prophet continued to drive this same message home. Israel would be scattered into the nations, to the Goyim. They would be assimilated into the Goyim, mixing, mingling, marrying, adopting the pagan practices of the very cultures in which they came to reside in. Now pay attention, because there's going to be a quiz at the end of this series. No, because these things are going to come full circle. So that's why we're covering this, okay? There is a method to our madness. And man, some people just don't like to be thorough. They don't like to cover this stuff. They just want to jump into the New Testament and say, hey, there's me. That's me. I'm a Gentile. No, get your butt back here into Deuteronomy, into the story, and I'll show you who the Gentiles are. Okay, sorry. Got a little preachy there. Forgive me, my brother. Pay attention, because there's some key words here that I really want you to remember. Ezekiel 6, 8 and 9. Again, just a couple examples. I will leave a remnant so that you may have some who escape the sword among the nations. When you are scattered throughout the countries, then those of you who escape will remember me among the nations where they are carried away captive, or carried captive, because I was crushed by their adulterous heart, which departed from me, by their eyes, which play the harlot after their idols. You see what's going on there? How about Zechariah 2? I have scattered you among the four winds of heaven, declares the Lord. I have scattered them with the whirlwind among all the nations that they have not known. Jeremiah 9. I will scatter them among the nations that neither they nor their fathers have known. I will scatter them like chaff driven by the desert wind. Psalm 44, 11. You have given us as sheep to be devoured. You have scattered us among the nations. How about Nehemiah chapter 1? The word that you commanded your servant Moses when you said, if you are unfaithful, I will scatter you among the nations. How about Daniel chapter 9? To you, O Lord, belongs righteousness, but this day we are covered with shame. The men of Judah, the people of Jerusalem, and all Israel, near and far, in all the countries where you have driven us, because of our unfaithfulness to you. There was Israel near, and there was Israel far. Okay, and I could go on and on and on. There's probably like 100 similar verses that I could share with you. But you see what's going on here. And you see the relationship really between idolatry, unfaithfulness, and Israel's scattering. Okay? And you notice what Israel's called, what they're referred to. Who's being scattered? The sheep. Israel is the sheep. Okay? They are being scattered throughout the nations. So that all Israel was near and far. You had all Israel near and far, and that's really important. And so, again, you got to think from Israel's perspective, specifically the house of Judah, really, to be other than Israel, to be separated or apart from the covenant community, was to be goyim. It was to be associated with the unclean, the other, the nations, the tribes, the goyim out there, to be part and parcel with them. And that's what the house of Israel became through their scattering. Not only not practicing law, but you know what? Worse, they actually adopted the pagan practices of the nations in which they found themselves. And we know, like the Assyrians, for example, they invaded, and the northern tribes basically assimilated, and they married into the Assyrian culture or cultures. So you know what? I think it's fair to say that Israel, they would be, and they were scattered, and they actually became, or they were assimilated into every tribe, every tongue, and every nation. Hey, that sounds like Revelation. You know what? We're going to get there. Okay, so all this scattering, assimilation, pagan practices, do you know what this made them in relationship to Yahweh and in relationship to Yahweh's still covenant people, the house of Judah? It made them Gentile. That's what it made them. They were the Goyim. They had become Gentile. And we just don't like this. Now, if you were paying attention, when we looked at Genesis chapter 48, Ephraim was promised to become a multitude of Gentile, a multitude of Goyim, right? And if you were thinking, wait a minute, how the hell, pardon my French, could Israelites become a bunch of Gentiles, right? Well, you know what? Right now is an honesty check. Check yourself. Be honest. See, this progression of Israel's infiltration into the surrounding nations, the Gentiles, you know what? It just makes a heck of a lot of sense in light of what was predicted and what we see happening. And if you stay with me, it's going to make a hell of a lot more sense in the New Testament when we get there. Israel was the prodigal son who didn't stay in their father's house with all its potential blessings. Instead, what did they do? Well, they went out whoring into the nations, and they wallowed in the muck, in the mire of the Gentiles and the gods of the Gentiles. That's what they did. But eventually, the elect would come running back, right, to their father, Abba, Father, through the opportunity of a new covenant, but we're going to get to that. So, idolatry, unfaithfulness. You know what? That is just thematic throughout the prophets. Let me give you some Hosea chapter 4 miscellaneous verses. I'm going to kind of do a gunshot, rapid fire shot. Here you go. Hear the word of the Lord, you children of Israel, for the Lord brings a charge against the inhabitants of the land. That's Israel. My people are destroyed for lack of knowledge because you have rejected knowledge. I will also reject you from being priests for me because you have forgotten the law of your God. I will also forget your children. My people ask counsel for wooden idols, and their staffs inform them, for the spirit of harlotry has caused them to stray. The sheep are straying. Though you, Israel, play the harlot, let not Judah offend, although they did in many ways. Listen to this. Ephraim, Genesis 48, Ephraim is joined to idols. Let them alone. Don't touch them. Let them go. I'll bring them back some other time. Let them go. Ephraim is joined to idols. Let them alone. Their drink is rebellion. They commit harlotry continually, and they have played the harlot against their God. How about Hosea 13:1? When Ephraim spoke, trembling, he exalted himself in Israel. But when he offended in Baal, as in Baal worship, he died. Now what do? They sin more and more and more and more. What's the result? Well, basically, Yahweh said, okay, Ephraim, I'm going to leave you alone. In fact, you know what? I'm divorcing you. I'm done. Continue with your pagan Gentile ways. Eventually, there'll be an opportunity for redemption through a new covenant marriage. But now, adios. Get out of here. Jeremiah 3:8. Then I saw that for all the causes for which backsliding Israel had committed adultery, I put her away and given her a certificate of divorce. Yet her treacherous sister Judah did not fear, but went and played the harlot also. Man, you know what? All this is a little bit depressing, man, isn't it? Yeah, I think it is. Israel's first covenant and law were the ministry of death, according to Paul. It was the curse of the law. Remember, they were under the curse. Yes, there could be potential blessings, but let's face it, the curses of the covenant overtook them like a bunch of weeds. This was the condition. I like to call this the bad news. This was the bad news. They were overridden with the bad news. The first covenant produced the curse and the death, which was bad. It was the bad news. It was bad all over, bad to the bone. But the new covenant would produce life. And that was the good news. But I'm hoping that you see at this point right here, all these things are under the umbrella of covenant. Israel's covenant. And honestly, as of right now, you ain't in the story. I'm sorry. And if you think you are a Gentile that will eventually become invited into this story, well, I invite you to stay with me on this series, and we're going to look at that together. But we've got lesson 1 and we've got lesson 2, and right now I hope you're following along and you're with me up to this point. Okay, so here's today's big takeaway. Here's the number one thing that I want you to remember in this lesson, okay? It's how Israel literally, actually became the Goyim, the Gentiles, by being scattered into the Goyim, the nations. Again, to separate from Israel, to become not my people, as Hosea 1 puts it, to be issued a divorce decree, as Jeremiah explains it, is to be placed outside the covenant community and become other than Israel. And that puts those who were scattered and assimilated into their respective pagan nations in the Gentile category, the Goyim category. This was the trajectory of their story, and this is what happened. Okay, that's it for now. Today, we focused on the scattering, the bad news, but you know what? Next lesson, we're going to focus on the gathering, the good news, and more importantly, we're going to look at exactly who out of the nations would be gathered, who would receive that good news. So I think you see where we're going with this. So up next, lesson number 3, we'll look at that. And thank you so much for joining me. I'm having a good time with this. I hope you are too. We'll see you next lesson. Take care, and adios.
Jew and Gentile, one in Messiah, one in Yeshua, one in the olive tree. Jew and Gentile, one in Messiah.